Hi everyone, it's Nick with Build Up Advisory Group, and it's Fast Forward Fridays, a web series where we will quickly build what you know about infrastructure design in the nonprofit sector. Today's Fast Forward topic is how to build an effective grant making process. It's the third and final part of this three-part series that began with Fast Forward Friday episodes 43 and 44. In those episodes, we talked about the first two of three building blocks to build an effective grant making process. We said the first building block you need is to understand your organization's values. And the second building block is understanding and defining risk. We also explained that these two building blocks need to be put together in this order. So we turn first to values, then to risk, and then to this third building block. Now, this third building block is challenging. I know. You're probably thinking, Nick, the first two building blocks are also challenging. Look, I agree. Building an effective grant making process takes time, and you have to be willing to struggle well in order to create an effective process. So, what is the third building block? Can you guess? The third building block is that you must ensure that the core and overall design of the process are equitable and inclusive. I was just having a conversation with a friend who's also a thought leader in the sector, and we were discussing this latest observation we had of the sector and saying that you build, quote, equitable grant making processes, and whether we should simply say we build grant making processes. From this discussion, I realized that the calling out of equity or calling out of inclusion is based on the framework from which you're starting to build. At Build Up, we start from a place of thinking that there's no other kind of grant making. So when someone says to me, do you build your grant making with an equity lens? To me, that's like saying grant making. It sounds redundant to me to say equitable grant making because of the way I've designed and built grant making processes and infrastructure over the years. In my mind, there's no other way to build. What I've learned and seen, though, is that not everyone builds this way. So I understand the importance of calling out equity and inclusion, and that's why we'll do it here. When someone comes to me and says, Nick, we need help incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, into our grant making because our grant making is disproportionately not with organizations led by people of color, I know immediately that the problem isn't just DEI. The problem is you haven't addressed the first two building blocks. So you haven't done your value setting, and you haven't defined risk, because if you had, your grant making portfolio would look very different. It would be equitable if equity is something you value, and it would be inclusive if inclusion is something you value. And you would have grappled with your understanding of what risk is in a grant and in a grantee, what makes you uncomfortable, including entity type and who's leading, and how equitable or inclusive that analysis is. When you haven't put these two building blocks in place, your misaligned values and risk profile are shown in your grant portfolio. You can't then turn to the grant portfolio and think that you can inject DEI principles into it to make it proportional. You risk engaging in tokenism by approaching it that way. Instead, you have to break it all down to build it back up again using these three building blocks. So this third building block is omnipresent in that way. At each building block phase, you address equity and inclusion in your approach, analysis, discussion, and struggle, and then finally ensure that the entire process has been assembled in this way. You have to examine your grant-making materials, including your application, diligence requests, reporting templates, grant agreement, the language you're using throughout the process, and how you're selecting partners. And you ensure that your organizational infrastructure allows for equity in its grant making. So who are your decision makers and how are they selected? And how do your organizational policies speak to equity and inclusion? It all matters. This is what it takes to be equitable. These three building blocks are essential to any effective grant making process. You cannot build an effective grant making process without understanding your organizational values, defining and understanding risk, and ensuring that the core and design of the process are equitable and inclusive, in that order. It's the only way we build. These three building blocks create grant-making processes that remove communities from the margins, support leaders that have been historically excluded by unverified risk and bias, and allow for brave transformations of outcomes that change narratives for generations. And that's our fast build. I want to hear how you are thinking about building effective grant making processes. I would love to hear from you and about your experience in the comments below. And if you're finding these Fastball Fridays helpful or informative, I would love it if you would like this video and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, have a wonderful weekend, and keep building bravely.